Dr. Magan, I disagree with you. I do not think you have any right to ask me a question like that.
Would you like to correct me if I say that this is theocratic, or would you say that perhaps this is, or am I just, reading this the wrong way?
What makes you think that you are disqualified or indeed excluded from his definitions of nationalism?
We have to be honest with how we approach Tagore's work, because I thought that his definition of nationalism doesn't include me. He was lambasting the system in India, particularly the caste. This is beautiful, an evening that we have. Good evening, everyone. This is me, Rhodora, and my co-host, of course, we have Professor Arup Chatterjee.
A very good evening, Dr. Rhodora Magan. What a wonderful pleasure to see you again.
We have to thank our viewers for helping us grow our community. Say something, please, about that before we continue.
We've had a wonderful response to our previous episode, and we are filming for the benefit of our viewers. Let me share that we are filming not too many days from the last recording that we did, and this is partly inspired by the amazing reception that viewers have offered towards our last episode, which was on ghosts on Indian railways, and Satyajit Ray, another great Bengali artist, filmmaker, author, and cultural thinker and critic. And today we are going to discuss another very eminent Bengali intellectual. But this just brings me to the point of how wonderfully our cross-cultural conversations have been responded to by people, because we are discussing topics that could seem like they're rooted in one culture or one kind of historical reality. But the fact that they seem to be appealing on a relatively more universal scale, I think speaks volumes of our listeners, and to some extent, maybe the quality of our podcast as well. What do you say, Dr. Magan?
We have been pouring our heart and soul into this, and the information they're getting from this podcast is just very extraordinary. Speaking of the extraordinary things we do here, we are banking on the brilliance of this very famous figure, Rabindranath Tagore. Earlier, I asked you whether or not to do the rhotic sound, and I thought that it's a good justice to do to his name, Tagore, because he is really a very famous figure in different cultures, and it is not just confined in the Indic tradition. I mean, his resonance across the globe is just so evident. Why not start with who he is, Professor Chatterjee? Who is Rabindranath Tagore?
Thank you so much, Dr. Magan. And you have pronounced Rabindranath Tagore's name as wonderfully as anybody could. Rabindranath Tagore, or Robi Thakur, or Rabindranath Thakur, as the full name goes in Bengali, was born in a family of very eminent Bengali industrialists and cultural critics and reformers in 1861. Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather was Dwarkanath Tagore, who was a great Bengali Swadeshi industrialist, and he owned a large part of Indian businesses, particularly Indian coal industry, and had grand plans of making railways in India. This is the decade of 1840s, when Dwarkanath Tagore actually launched the Great Western of Bengal Company, and this could well have been the first railroad company in India, or the first one to have laid railroads. Eventually, his plans were taken over by British companies, and he passed on in 1845-46. And he left behind a very illustrious commercial and cultural legacy. His grandson, Rabindranath Tagore, was not as interested in economics as his grandfather was, but Tagore had bigger fish to fry. Tagore, who would go on to become a Nobel laureate in 1912, he was also awarded with a knighthood, which he famously returned in 1919 after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre tragedy, where several Sikhs and Indians were very callously killed by British soldiers under the orders of a practically mad British official. Now, between 1912 and 1919 comes a critical juncture in Tagore's life, that is around 1916 and 1917, when he starts traveling to the Far East and the Far West, that is Japan and America. And it is this time that Tagore's ideas acquire some kind of maturation, and Tagore is speaking like an internationalist. And many of those ideas that he propounded during this time might just feed our conversation today.
Wow, you really researched about him. Or should I say, not research, but, he is very much inside of you, because the very works of Tagore, the essays, the poems, are so ingrained in every Indian individual. Especially, if you're a Bengali, this has to be a classic orientation of what nationalism is. As you spoke about his background early on, there was some sort of a trace of knowing who he is in the Indian framework. When I say Indian framework, this is how the society functions. And this is how we get to know of India at the moment. So, whatever happened before during his time, early 20th century, that is the kind of resonance that Tagore would want, the Gen Z Indians would actually realize. So, Professor Chatterjee, earlier you told me that this is a beautiful way for you to channel your own identity as well, being a Bengali. And I'd like you to talk about this ideology of your existence with respect to Tagore's idea of nationalism.
Thank you, Dr. Magan, for that question. I think it is important for us to highlight that Tagore was not merely a musician, a song composer. He composed nearly 2,000 songs. He was not merely a poet and a literator, although those are a mouthful already, but he was also a very keen political thinker. And the fodder for our conversation today comes from his essay titled Nationalism in India, which was published in America in 1917. But prior to that, it was delivered to the Americans in the same year. And it is part of his three lectures: Nationalism in the West, Nationalism in Japan, and Nationalism in India, which are taken as a triptych of his ideas on nationalism. So while Tagore begins this essay or this lecture by saying that the problems of India are not political but social, and it would seem that Tagore was largely an apolitical person, or so he claimed. It is evident to us that, in the sense, in the meanings of the word politics that we take today, Tagore was definitely a very, very complex thinker. And he begins by saying that nationalism is one of the greatest menaces, and it is at the bottom of all of India's troubles. The current scenario in India, in South Asia, and in several parts of the world, at a time when the ideologies of nationalism are on an omnipresent surge, it would seem, Tagore might be hastily labeled as what one might call an anti-national. But if one goes through Tagore's essay and contextualizes it in the history that Tagore lived through, I think a deeper sense emerges, and that is what we are after today.
Professor Chatterjee, I thought that I have to say this to you. I should not have to entertain this kind of thought, but I think we have to be honest with how we approach Tagore's work, because I thought that his definition of nationalism doesn't include me. I mean, would you say that, yeah, you're amenable to the idea? My the central provocation here is that he is excluding other people there, including myself. How do you react to this?
I think I would like to impersonate how Tagore would react to such a question, and he would definitely not say, Dr. Magan, I disagree with you. I do not think you have any right to ask me a question like that. That is not what Tagore would tell you, Dr. Magan. Rather, Tagore would ask you, what makes you think that you are disqualified or indeed excluded from his definitions of nationalism? Because Tagore begins defining nationalism as what might be understood as nation statism. Tagore makes clear differences between patriotism and nationalism. To quote the Indian critic Ashish Nandi, who is a psychoanalyst, and he was one of the most influential thinkers at the beginning of the 21st century, patriotism is not something like nationalism, which is radical and which can become political. Patriotism, on the other hand, is largely biological, and animals and human beings both enjoy healthy magnitudes of patriotism in their own system. So these are, God gifted or naturally gifted ideas and principles that we all grew up with. But nationalism, on the other hand, is something that Tagore saw as a great menace, because he was a nationalist to begin with. At the birth of the 20th century, India saw a brutal partition of Bengal in 1905, a partition that was annulled in 1912 because of Swadeshi or nationalist movements. But that partition left very bloody scars, and scars from which India could not come out unscathed. And the partition of India in 1947 was in many ways a continuation of the partition of Bengal in 1905. And that is why Tagore joined the nationalist movement, the movement that wanted to unite the two Bengals of West and the East. And Tagore went around tying rakhis or colored threads around the wrists of Muslim brethren and that act was reciprocated by both the communities in the two bigger communities, that is Hindus and Muslims in Bengal. But by the end of the peace era and by the beginning of the First World War, Tagore started to witness the rise of extremism. And Indian nationalists were split into moderates and extremists. And the Indian National Congress, that had been founded in 1885, according to Tagore, began seriously lacking a programmatic enterprise. And it did not have any clear political agenda to not only get political freedom for India, but also the kind of spiritual freedom that was necessary for India and Indians to continue after British rule. And this is what took Tagore away from nationalism, and he became a critic of nationalism. So, any kind of religious agenda driven nationalism and any kind of economic nationalism was anathema to Tagore. And therefore, Tagore would like to ask you, what makes you think that you are excluded from his definitions or his critiques of nationalism? Because indeed, he is advocating for your rights and for my rights to talk across this invisible divide and to unite across international borders.
Well, I thought that essentially there is the idea of syncretism. And it seemed to me, while reading the essay, that there's a need to be homogenous at that. At the same time, there's the idea of being heterogeneous. So between homogeneity and heterogeneity, Rabindranath, of course, is going for a solid nation, a solid state, grounded in tolerance of race, ethnicity, religion. So, on the one hand, there's homogeneity. On the other hand, there's heterogeneity. And as for me, for example, say I go for theocracy being homogenous, and that's when I said that, there's the exclusive take on what a nation should be. But speaking of this theocratic sort of trope in the reading of the essay of Tagore, based on how I see it, for example, would you like to correct me if I say that this is theocratic, or would you say that perhaps this is, or am I just, reading this the wrong way?
Thank you for that question again, Dr. Magan. Although I can't say that I'm exactly confident about the phrasing of that question, and particularly Tagore might raise very serious objections, because in the premise of that question, you refer to India being suggested as a theocracy either in the past or in the future, whereas Tagore would disagree with the very basis of that question, because according to Tagore, India does not even have the necessary ingredients of nationalism, let alone theocracy. The link between nationalism and theocracy is as follows. Nationalism is that basic glue or that basic ideology which treats nation as the most fundamental unit of your philosophical, your cultural existence. And theocracy is where the theos or some theological text gives autocracy or gives governance models to a nation state. So accordingly, I think since India lacks the basic principles of national unity, because India in Tagore's conception is divided into so many warring castes. Therefore, it is a huge problem. And just like America has the race problem, India has had the caste problem. Tagore is benevolent in his conception of caste, particularly in relation to somebody like Baba Sahib Ambedkar or B.R. Ambedkar, who would go on to later draft the Constitution of India. And he was totally antipathetic to the idea of caste system. And he played a yeoman's role in eradicating untouchability from India, at least in as far as constitutional theory goes. But Tagore had a slightly different notion of caste in India. He believed, like many others, including Gandhi, that the caste system initially was an institution meant to give freedom to groups of people within those groups. So, to say a scholar comes from a family of scholars, and his later generation would also become a family of scholars. Then to say a loco pilot comes from a family of locomotive pilots, and his future generation would go on to become a family of loco pilots. This essentially is the caste system, highly, highly simplified in Tagore's worldview. But he acknowledges, and this is what makes him common with Dr. Ambedkar, that in the present system scheme of things, nationalism has had a role to play in creating the caste system as an oppressive system, because under nationalism only certain groups get the assets of cultural and social control. And this, for lack of a better word, is often referred to as Brahmanism in the political and social sciences. Brahmanism is the supremacy, economic, cultural, social, by certain groups over other masses of people. And Tagore is one with Gandhi and Ambedkar in this regard. So Tagore says that the Indian nation itself is fragmented in terms of its social and cultural unity. How are you going to create automatons like you did in Europe, in France, in Germany, who treat India or who treat their nation as a one single unit? In France and Germany, as Tagore says, there is homogeneity, there is uniformity among races. And while India does not have different races, it has multiple cultures and it has multiple castes. And there is lack of cohesion. So to create a sense of nationalism in India is not only counterproductive, it could create tremendous violence and the kind of violence that he was witnessing. And in 5 years from Tagore's time in 1922, Indian nationalists would become so infuriated by British repressive measures in India that a conflagration happened uh, in 1922 during the Chauri Chaura episode, where Indian nationalists got together and they burned up a police station, and 22 British and Indian officers and civilians were killed in the episode. And Gandhiji called off the non-cooperation movement. So in 1917, when Tagore is speaking in a prophetic voice in America, he's talking about exactly these kinds of incidents that he wants to avoid, and the excesses of nationalism have therefore to be avoided. Apart from the fact that he suggests that India was one of the progenitors of the idea of international humanism, which people have forgot to preserve. And it was because of India's forgetfulness, it was because of India's cultural amnesia that India was colonized in the first place. And now it should not go down the European road. It should not go down the same route that its colonizers, like the British, the Portuguese, Dutch, and the French, took in the course of their own nationalisms, beginning from the 16th and 17th centuries.
Okay, from what you said, I'm seeing Tagore doing this lecture in America and going back to the idea that he was lambasting the system in India, particularly the caste. We can tell that he wants a society very similar to the American society, succinctly telling all the people listening to him that there's a problem with the European governance, and that talking specifically about Germany, France, England, we are seeing a picture of Rabindranath who demonizes the way they were led by the colonizers because it never worked out. I mean, it was his idea, to not infiltrate the Indian culture because essentially it's so rich. Saying this, Professor Chatterjee, I'd like to ask whether or not he wanted to create a very special relationship between India and the US, because while speaking to the American audience, I thought that he was trying to laud the way they were ruled and the way they have been ruled by the American politicians, by the American visionaries. Is this what Tagore was trying to say during the time? And is this the kind of message he's putting across centuries hence?
Um, if I have to talk about the time after Tagore passed on, he leaves us in 1941, and 1946-47 onwards, we have the drafting of the Constitution of India, in which, as I've told you, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar plays a stellar role. He leads the team practically, and that Constituent Assembly was largely influenced by the American Declaration of Independence 1776 and the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So American culture and the memories of the creation of America are still very fresh in 1917. And Tagore, being a polymath, certainly wants to distinguish America not only from European nationalisms in France, Germany, Britain, and elsewhere, but also wants to differentiate America from the Bolshevik Revolution of the summer of 1917 and the unforeseen assassination of Tsar Nicholas II, which was completely unexpected. It was a very bloody culmination of a revolution that was otherwise meant for national prosperity and equal distribution of resources. This was not the end that somebody like Tagore would ever propound, because this was also a kind of an excess of nationalistic fervor. He wants to definitely align with America insofar as he considers India to be a natural ally and a natural model or a natural kind of a parallel to America, because America America, which is the United States of America, serves as a model for India to create what he calls a Hindu federation of states. Now, that phrase can be considered excessively problematic in the present context because the term Hindu is very different from the way Tagore uses it. Hinduism is of a fairly recent coinage. I know most people in India would disagree. It is not the idea, but the word that I'm talking about here. Hinduism is divided into multiple sects, and as we say in India, there are 330 million gods and goddesses. But the Hindu faith is not really a religion in the Abrahamic sense of the word religion. So when Tagore talks about a Hindu federation of states, what he means of Hindu is a geocultural identity. And he wants people to recognize this geocultural identity as not something that is closed, but that is deeply fluid and that has accepted and welcomed influences, migrants, and cultures for millennia. And Tagore, I think it is important to remind our viewers, especially in India, is very often Tagore is seen today as an anti-national thinker, or people on the left would consider Tagore as their hero because the left is critical of excessive nationalism. But Tagore was himself deeply nationalistic. His national anthem, the ones that he wrote for India and Bangladesh, and arguably also composed for Sri Lanka, these anthems are still remembered today. And he was part of the Brahmo sect. The Brahmos broke away from the Hindu faith in the early 19th century, and they started valorizing the Upanishads or Vedanta, which is the end of the Vedas. So Tagore and the Tagore family and the entire sect of Brahmos, you might say that they were anti-Hindu in a philosophical sense of that phrase, but they were reading and they were refining the same texts that Hinduism had been built on for millennia. So the Upanishads and the Vedanta inform a lot of Tagore's ideas, and that is why he says that we have to raise ourselves to a higher state of civilization. America is not condoned by Tagore, although he is slightly diplomatic in his utterance that it is not America that has exterminated its native population, but it is Europe or Europeans. So when they went to America, they exterminated the natives there, and indeed also in Australia. But America today happens to be a model for a Hindu federation of states. And while yes, I think this can be considered a sort of a revisionist theocracy of sorts, I think it is completely the opposite of what Tagore had in mind. He meant Hindu as a cultural identity.
So from that, I could say he was in a way misunderstood. And when we talked about Tagore a couple of times, there was some sort of an implied idea that his brilliance was downplayed. All these philosophies were downplayed. And in this type of downplaying of these ideas, people try to find a niche for Tagore. However, this niche is the creative niche, not so much of the political niche. Professor Chatterjee, why are people doing this? Was there a complete defiance against what he is saying? That's why they're channeling his ideas into the creative spectrum.
This is a wonderful question. So, on the one hand, Tagore was never marginalized. Tagore has almost never gone out of fashion in India, especially in Bengal. But that name, that utterance, has created it's developed an aura or a semiotics of its own that is not always seen in a positive light because Tagore was heavily museumized. And yes, you are absolutely right in suggesting that he was therefore marginalized in the real matters, in the real domains where he should have mattered. But in parts he was instead museumized. So Tagore was a musician, he was a literature, and it was these, he also became a painter in his later life, and it was these aspects that were museumized and in a sense fossilized by Bengali culture, because as the 60s and the 70s progressed, and we discussed this in the last episode also to some extent, as the inequities, the social hierarchies increased, and the economics in Bengal suffered due to decades of what might be termed as leftist rule, but it was simply bad rule. The ideology is not important, the policies were horrible. And because of this suffering that Bengal underwent, from one of the richest culturally and economically speaking states in India, it collapsed. And this collapse in Bengal led to the creation of an elite, a cultural and intellectual elite that preserved Tagore as a museumized idea, and therefore they constantly would celebrate the songs of Tagore and the writings of Tagore during his birthday in early May and on his death anniversary and sing his national anthem. But they would forget what Tagore actually stood for. In fact, Tagore had the gall, he had the both the guts and the privilege to go against Gandhi during Gandhi's lifetime. Not many people would be able to boast of that power, and Gandhi was not offended. Gandhi and Tagore engaged in what can be called the great debate. Not many people have had the luxury or the privilege of going against Gandhi in a sane, reasonable, and unemotional, passionless manner in the language that we are talking today, respectfully perhaps disagreeing with each other. And this was the tone of the conversations that Gandhiji and Tagore had. And Tagore had serious disagreements with Gandhi's superstitions and Gandhi's open Hinduism and flaunting of a nationalistic Indic identity, whereas Tagore was far more civilizational. So, yes, he was misunderstood in the sense that he wanted a much, much bigger vision of an independent Indian country, not a nation state. But sadly, those are the places, that is politics, so social building, institution building, where Tagore is least recognized, whereas it is in the schools, colleges, cultural activities, textbook curricula that Tagore continues to be popular. Alas, I'm not sure if that amounts to a lot of practical value.
If I may recall, that's Getanjali. Is it Getanjali or Getanjali? Famous work of Tagore.
Gitanjali, his song of
Ah,
offerings to an unnamed deity and unnamed god. Very often, the god seems like it is within him, or very often it's a god that visits him on rainy afternoons. So, Gitanjali is dedicated to an ambivalent, or should I say, a multivalent god. And it is therefore in that universal god that Tagore wanted to drown his spirit and all our spirits.
yeah, that's why I emancipated the conversation to the idea of God, theocracy, because that was something that I read all throughout. I mean, he wanted unification, he wanted just one, he never wanted a pantheon. And that's why it brought to me the concept of whether or not Tagore was really struggling as well, having this dilemma within himself as well, because in having Gitanjali or Gitanjali, there's this inner drive for him to really honor that ultimate divine being up there, and perhaps this is the reason why he was made to be very prominent, not in the political spectrum, but in the creative spectrum, because people wanted to mythologize him and his ideas. Because, in a way, it's leading them to believe in one God. In India, basically, one syncretism and the pantheon and everything. Professor Chatterjee, how similar is this with hagiography? Because in the medieval era, there's hagiography, right? The offering of songs as well.
Tagore was a wonderfully chosen candidate for hagiography because
Okay.
Tagore was wonderfully gifted by nature or God. He was quite an imposing figure physically. He had a very long beard, which stands out the moment you look at Tagore, and he had beady eyes, and these were of a philosopher or a stoic, so somebody who has clearly suffered a lot in life. He went through tremendous personal losses and grief. Although he was born with a silver spoon, he definitely was able to feel the sufferings of his countrymen, not just political and in social contexts, but also emotionally. And I think that is what helped him stay motivated to write all those and produce all that art. But apart from that, I think. Tagore would have once again very serious disagreements with the initial part of your phrasing of that question, because you are, or rather, your question is attempting to culminate in monotheism, whereas there's a very important concept which is monism or non-dualism in the Indian Upanishadic sense, which is very different from a god up there or a god down there or a god on the east or a god on the west. Monotheism is a highly Abrahamic concept. Doesn't mean it is necessarily flawed or necessarily something that is to be celebrated. It's just a characteristic, whereas non-dualism does not differentiate between the human and the non-human and the godly. But it is not as easy as it sounds. One not only requires a thorough reading of ancient scriptures, but one has to internalize them in one's life. Uh, just as you very rightly suggested, that he was marginalized because there are strands uh, in the pantheon. It could be the Hindu pantheon, or it could be various other religious pantheons in India that have this Abrahamic tendency of late, and that is why it is not very easy to understand Tagore.
Professor Chatterjee, earlier you mentioned how Tagore was designated to the creative zone in India. Well, I would say at least people won't forget him. And over time, as people continue to talk about him and relish his beautiful poems and beautiful creations, there seems to be a culture that is going to be hailed as Tagore culture in the 21st century. And I'm talking about this because I'd like you to respond to the idea that basically Tagore would want to emphasize on the geocultural boundaries, which which are basically no longer there. Well, talking about 21st century, and there's media, there's technology. Do you think that Tagore was able to really predict the 21st century scenario by saying that in the essay, that these geopolitical boundaries, geocultural boundaries, are no longer necessary? And yeah, they are necessary, but they are not literally there to confine people and to delimit people from doing whatever they want to do in terms of socializing with other people across the globe, in terms of making themselves known as a different race and mingling to be able to impact other cultures as well. This is beautiful, an evening that we have. The discussion is so brilliant.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Magan. Yes, and that is a very pertinent question. I'm glad there are parts of the essay that I have not touched on yet, because your question allows me to address those. Again, towards the beginning of the essay itself, Tagore acknowledges that, or rather, Tagore warns us, I should add, that nationalism, despite his own initial nationalistic tendencies, nationalism was not without its great baggages in Europe. It emerged not because necessarily of national solidarity or unity to begin with, but it emerged because a national populace within the geocultural, geopolitical confines started to feel a great deal of animus for an other. Now, sometimes this was a national other, on other occasions, it was an imagined other. A national other generally, took shape when France or Germany or Italy or Britain was conceiving of itself as one nation and trying to prevent threats from foreign nations, and imaginary others started getting formed in the minds of the leaders of these nations, especially during the war era. India has witnessed the tensions of British American and British Russian and British German tensions throughout the years of the First World War and the Second World War. America wanted India to be independent far earlier, around 1940 or 41, whereas Britain, Winston Churchill especially, did not want that. Russia and Britain were engaged in the Crimean War and the Great War, or the Great Game of the 19th century. And then, these warring states and nations were also dictating their terms and their conditions during the First World War to Indian destinies. Now, the way all this is linked is because Tagore tells us that the Indian uh, civilization was not founded on ideals of competition. There was no aggressive competition for arms. There was no arms race because India had plenty of means, unlike the European nations, which started developing themselves, and it all culminated to the Industrial Revolution precisely because Europe was short of means. And that is why Europe went into so many different directions. Famously, Tagore also writes that the victims of European nationalism can be found in all the other great nations of the world, including India. That's a remarkable statement. Um, Tagore, to answer your question, also predicted the dissolving of distances. We have spoken about Harari and how artificial intelligence has invaded into our lives, but just the technologies of railways and steamships were enough, and the telephone were enough to inform Tagore that these geopolitical boundaries do not exist any longer. So, if you continue to see the nation as the fundamental unit of your identity, then you are no better than a zombie or an automaton. Uh, Tagore also mentions that Europe has lost touch with its higher nature, its civilizational state, but at the same time, Europe preserves its subtle invented traditions, like wine tasting, like ceremonial, monarchical, the baptisms, like the exchange of crown, and so on. So these to use Eric Hobsbawm's phrase, are invented traditions, whereas America and India are fairly young, and therefore they can go in multiple positive directions. So to stop people from crossing over, not just through borders, but through these mental obstacles, was a great panacea, according to Tagore. And there are historical reasons too for his articulation. I think there is a great deal of similarity readers will find in the same criticism that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar offers for the anti-caste movement in India, that Tagore offers for an anti-nation state movement across America and India and across the Atlantic and Mediterranean.
Amazing. Um, this predictive ability of the man, Tagore, can be seen as well in the stream of life. I thought that you're familiar, very much familiar. Just to capture a slice of idea there. The river and the stream, they don't move alike, Professor Chatterjee, according to the Bengali guy Tagore. I know for sure that our audiences today are very enthralled hearing what this all means to the 21st century Gen Z people. The idea that the world is shrinking by the day because of technology. And that for Tagore, this is beautiful. This is brilliant because there's more integration and there's the diminishing of the effect of the caste system, which you said earlier, he wanted to really revamp and sort of educate the Indian people that this is not the way to go. If there is a need for a solid society, a strong nation. Tonight, Professor Chatterjee, it's beautiful if you could enhance the concept of patriotism and nationalism as a way of closing this brilliant discussion.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and your very, parliamentary opinions as well, Dr. Magan. It's a pleasure to hear those from you. To give you the theoretical definition and also to give you a very practical example from recent times. So this is what I tell my students: patriotism stems from the root padre or pater, and it's something to do with your fatherland, or motherland, call it that if you will. So it is love for your territory, it is love for your soil, it is because I'm guessing a lot of Indian viewers will be viewing this. It is Desh Bhakti, it is Desh Prem, it is even Rashtravad, which is, I claim, wrongly translated as nationalism. So patriotism is love for your family, friends, and even the protective sense that we feel towards them, towards our society, and even maybe the willingness to die if required in extreme conditions. Nationalism, on the other hand, we should not forget that there is a technicality and there's a historicity to that words. It is not simply nationism. It's clearly greater than the sum of its parts. There's a historical context to the word or the phenomenon of nationalism, and ever so often it gets tied with some kind of economic and cultural hegemony. Especially in economics, there is an oligopoly, there's an oligarchy which tends to get entangled with these nationalistic ideas. And while on the surface, a lot of these ideas seem very democratic, very egalitarian, just like they did in 1930s Italy and Germany, at the culmination of these kinds of nationalisms, the road does not look rosy at all. There is a lot of bloodshed. There's a unforeseen animosity. You simply cannot explain where all this came from at the end of the day. And this is what Tagore was warning us against. So we have to understand that a lot of so-called nationalist thinkers of the last decade or so are also changing their minds. To give you an example from the Indian context, recently this created some kind of headlines. There's a very important organization in India called the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh. If I have to translate that into English very crudely, it would stand for uh, the National Self Helpers Group, or the Self Sustaining Group. What that means is that they are reformers, or at least that is what they would like to think of themselves. They are largely of a Hindu bent of mind, and they want to propagate Hindu cultural ideas, which again on the surface are highly benevolent and highly important for Indian society. But the RSS has also got entangled in some kinds of very rigid Hindu centric nativist essentialist discourses, which tries to spread ideas of Indian or Hindu victimhood. That is the rough background. I know people from both sides of the spectrum will not like that definition. But the RSS chief, Mohan Bhagwat ji, the Sar Sanchalak, as he's called, recently created headlines. He was attending a gathering where people, while hailing him on the stage, started sloganeering "Bharat Mata Ki Jai." Bharat Mata Ki Jai used to be a very important slogan during the days of the nationalist movement. We required that Bharat Mata Ki Jai, that is, praise be to Mother India, or Vande Mataram, Mother I fall at your feet. So these slogans were very important for Indians to unite. But today they are connected in their semiotics with a Hindu centric idea of a nation state, which is not very acceptable to people, even like Mohan Bhagwatji, who, when he started speaking, he said politely to the audience that everything has its season, everything has its time and place. This is not the place, this is not the time for this kind of sloganeering. This is exactly what Tagore was telling us back in 1917. This is exactly what Gandhiji would go on to tell us in 1922 when he took when he lifted the non-cooperation movement, and again in the decade of the 1940s, when excessive nationalism was, as the leaders recognized, leading to excessive fragmentation and excessive suspicion and tension between the communities. This is what we have to avoid. And even an organization like the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is unapologetically Hindu, realizes today that we cannot be excessive in our sloganeering campaigns. So I have invoked the name of this leader and this organization, not with any sense of praise or animosity, no criticism, but I'm stating facts. So this, I think, explains a patriotic stance. What Honorable Mohan Bhagwatji was doing that day was giving a patriotic message. But if this was allowed, if abuse of the name of the nation goes on, in the name of Bharat Mata, in the name of some Hindu god or goddess, I think that would be an excess of nationalism that we have to avoid.
You're saying there's moderation. When you spoke of to everything there's a season, that's so biblical. And going back to the discursivization of all these things, you took some time to really elucidate how this should be absorbed. Destiny, fate, that's where you find these men and women in history who challenged certain types of problems in society, issues even. And Tagore was one of them. Professor Chatterjee, thank you for elucidating very critical viewpoints. This is Indian context, and I know that our audience is pretty much happy to hear this, to be able to mirror this particular happening in Southeast Asia, which is very relevant in Southeast Asia. In many walks of life, whatever culture you belong, there's universality in all of this. See the struggle for nationalism, the struggle for unification, the struggle for progress as a collective entity. That is so universal and it's so understandable as well. Professor Chatterjee, thank you for, again, giving this platform for our audience to think and think and think as we continue lavishing ourselves with beautiful principles.
Exactly. What a wonderful note to end. As Tagore said, whether head is held high and the mind is without fear, and when knowledge is free. So these conversations that we have been holding is also about freeing knowledge, and also freeing knowledge from ourselves. The kind of shackled knowledge that we as educators and professors seem to be wielding. I don't think we are possessors, we are not hegemons of knowledge, but even we are perhaps evolving through these conversations. And I really love the note that you have ended on, Dr. Magan. I think it might just be time to thank our viewers. So why don't I give it over to you?
Thank you, dear viewers, for continuing, for sustaining this habit of listening to very important discussions. The analyses given to you are so perfect to ponder on these very profound ideas about existence, collective existence, and the nation at the middle of it is going to benefit or going to really, really suffer as well, depending on how people receive this whole concept of moving forward, as Professor Chatterjee spoke of.
Thank you, Dr. Magan. I think we have to tell our viewers that if you like this conversation and the previous podcasts that we have been running and the forthcoming episodes that we have planned for you, please like, share, subscribe, and please do comment. Like I said in the previous episode, even if you have an opinion to share, even if you pretend to not like all the aspects of our conversations, please feel free to express yourself in the civil manner that I'm sure all of you are so much endowed with. Dr. Magan, would you like to add anything to that?
Of course, our dear viewers, please do like if you think there is some sense in everything that we do here. Please subscribe as well because you cannot miss out on anything that we are giving to you in the next few days. And comment because your ideas are so special. We would love to see you engage with us. Others would want to know your thoughts as well regarding the session today, the episode today. And like Professor Chatterjee said to you, there are a lot more to come. And we don't want you to miss out on it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Magan. On that note, it is Arup K. Chatterjee signing off, bidding you all a warm goodbye from wherever you are watching. And since I'm an Indian, I would be saying namaste. And Dr. Magan?
I'm a Cebuana, so I would say maayong gabi natong tanan, daghan kaayong salamat sa pagpabino. It's an honor to have you on our show.